And welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
Welcome back to another episode of Research Works podcast. We are very lucky to be joined by another wonderful guest and a really interesting topic to talk to you all about today. On the show, we've got Associate Professor Ben Jackson from the University of Western Australia and Telethon Kids Institute. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Ash.
Welcome, Ben. We are very much looking forward to our conversation with you today.
Thanks, Dana. I hope I live up to expectations.
I have to say, I know, again, this is a podcast and you can't see Ben, but he's very tall. But I think I'm really just grateful that we're all sitting down and we're on an equal playing field here. My neck was getting a little bit sore looking up. But I'm super excited because this topic about messaging and communication in the area of exercise, physical activity and health is just something that's so relevant to all of us. And, you know, developing the relational skills is just so important when we're talking to people, because at the end of the day, our interventions are designed to support people and to possibly make some changes. And if we haven't got a communication piece of it right, we can have all the great interventions in the world, but not actually be able to communicate it. So this is super exciting. Thanks for being here.
So for our listeners, a bit of background about Associate Professor Ben Jackson, who, as we said, has a shared appointment between Telethon Kids Institute and UWA. And at Telethon Kids, Ben is the head of the Institute's Brain and Behaviour Research Focus Area. And at UWA, he's an associate professor in the School of Human Sciences. Ben's research and community programming activity within the Psychology of Active Healthy Living group, or PAHL group as we'll refer to it, is driven by a focus on listening to community priorities and designing programs that really tackle health challenges that matter. Ben's produced over 150 publications, and his work within the PAHL group has been supported with funding from agencies including the NH&MRC, ARC, Healthway, Lottery West and Sport Australia. Ben's also a deputy editor for Stress and Health, an associate editor for the Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology, and he serves on a number of editorial boards for other well-known journals in the field of health psychology and health promotion. He's also an adjunct professor at James Cook University and sits on advisory committees for Football West, Healthway, Exercise and Sport Science Australia, the NH&MRC, ARC and International Olympic Committee.
Oh, jeepers. This is a pretty amazing, Ben.
Don't expect too much. It makes me sound far more impressive than I think it is in real life.
Also a very self-deprecating human being. So it is super impressive and I think, you know, gives real weight to a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today, because Ben is definitely considered, I think, to be an expert in this field.
Absolutely.
So Ben, you may or may not have listened to our podcast before, but we normally like to start with a little icebreaker question just to learn a little bit more about each other and help our listeners to learn a little bit more about all of us as well. I have to admit I've chosen this question because I think you'll have quite an interesting answer to it, and I know you're very passionate about this area. So the question is, what is your favourite sandwich and why?
Do you expect, are we going to talk about anything else today? Because this could take a while.
Oh, wow.
I've spoken to Ash about this before. And I've told Ash that when the midlife crisis comes, it won't be a motorbike for me. It'll be a sandwich shack somewhere.
Oh, this is great.
So yeah, I am passionate about the sandwich, the great sandwich. Although my choice wouldn't be a very trendy one. It would be an egg salad. Oh. A classic egg salad sandwich. It's the Englishman in me coming out. I think an egg and cress is hard to beat. So that would probably be my option. Mm-hmm. If I could only have one sandwich ever again.
Oh, interesting.
And what makes a good egg and cress?
Well, you've got the smooth with the crunch, and that's a key ingredient of a good sandwich, isn't it? Smooth against texture.
Yeah.
The contrast in texture.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I want to go to this sandwich shack.
Uncle Ben's Sandwich Shack.
Uncle Ben's.
I mean, nobody will eat sandwiches there, but I'll be happy until the money runs out.
I think you could be on a trend there.
Yeah.
I love this question. I love that we're back to food again because we tried to intentionally take a break about finding out about people's interest in food and our love for food. So I love that this has come back. So my favourite sandwich would go back to, I'll go to the why first. So we were travelling through Italy as you do. It was about 10, 12 years ago, I would say, and we were in Venice. And we found this, we were just walking and my terrible sense of direction meant that I was completely off track.
Which we've also discussed on the podcast.
Discussed as well. And I found this amazing little deli and there were no tourists around. It was very clear because I stood out like a sore thumb. And we went into the shop and they were selling these amazing sandwiches that were so cheap, like €2.50, so cheap. And it was just basically prosciutto, parmesan, rocket. And that blew my mind. It was just the simplicity of it. It was so fresh. The prosciutto was just light and it was just so thin but generous. And like the contrast of the rocket was amazing. It was beautifully peppery and like the parmesan was almost sweet.
We'll stick it on the menu, Dana. When the sandwich shack's open, that one's going on the menu.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that simplicity. I love it. What about yours, Ash?
Look, breakfast is my favourite meal of the day. So I think my sandwich would have to be a breakfast sandwich. I'm going with a bacon, an egg. It's got to have a bit of cheese in there. Probably some kind of greenery, maybe spinach.
Is it just token greenery there though?
I think you need some just to make you feel like your arteries aren't like completely clogging up.
Token.
And then it needs to have relish.
Relish, yes.
You got to have the relish in there and it's got to be a toasted sandwich.
Yep.
That sounds good too.
It does sound really good.
You can add it to your menu if you like.
I'll
think about it.
I'll think about it.
Yeah.
Now that we're all hungry.
I don't just throw anything on the menu. No,
I know.
You got to do a good pitch.
Yeah.
All right. Well, now that we're all hungry and it's clearly sort of morning time here, so we do want to have a bit of a meal. So we may do that after we record the podcast. But for now, we should get into this whole area just about healthy living, and this is going to be great.
Not sandwiches.
Not sandwiches. I think it'd be healthy sandwiches.
Yeah.
So let's go into a bit of an overview about what we'll be talking about today. So a lot of the work of PAHL, so that's Psychology of Active Healthy Living, is around health promotion broadly through engagement in a service, program or initiative. So the evidence tells us that services, programs and initiatives are only useful if people adhere to or engage with them. And the science and research that PAHL undertakes is around understanding what helps or stops people from engaging in health promotion initiatives. For example, losing weight, eating better and being more physically active. PAHL's work is in the development and the delivery of health promotion initiatives underpinned by Ben and his team's understanding of motivation, communication and persuasion, social support, resilience and dealing with setbacks. So what we're going to talk about with Ben today is the science of persuasion and communication and the key take-home messages from PAHL's publications and programs.
So there's obviously a lot to cover in there today. But Ben, I thought before we kind of get into the specifics of those things that Dana mentioned, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about PAHL and the group that you and James Dimmock have built and how you came to feel so passionately about this area and how PAHL kind of came to be.
Yeah, thank you both. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. And any time that I'm lucky enough to talk on behalf of the whole group, it's really important to say up front and openly that, you know, there's an entire group that do all the work and I'm just the lucky one that gets to speak about it. So it's those people who deserve any and all credit. The kind of the development of the group, I started my work at UWA as a postdoc in 2008 and I was supposed to come out here for a 1-year job and it's now 14 years later. And the work that I suppose I did in the first couple of years was understanding health principles from a psychological perspective. So trying to understand what it is that makes people behave in the ways that they do or not do the things that we'd like them to do. A lot of what you would call, I guess, basic science or maybe a better term, discovery science, experimental psychology work and survey work and qualitative work, speaking to people to understand the processes behind what was going on. And I think we got to the point in about 2011 when James and I James was working at UWA with me, we were both, we'd formed a good friendship, and we're both really keen to do a little bit more than just find that stuff out. It felt really interesting for our sake, but it to an extent, I felt a little bit like research for research's sake. It wasn't necessarily reaching the community in the way that we would like it to. It was certainly reaching the academic community, and there's some value in that, but not the value that you would hope in terms of impact with real people, right? So we developed the PAHL group with that goal in mind, was to make sure that we could get our work out to, and more recently informed by the community in a proper way. So the work that we've developed over that sort of 10-year period has really been driven by that principle of, let's co-design with members of the population that we want to try and help, programs and services that they need, that are then embedded with the basic discovery psychological principles that we've worked on and that we understand, that can help those programs work for those people.
I love that. And so, I mean, as soon as you hear that, I think it's relevant for every single person, because how many times are you thinking about, communication, and how many times are you thinking about motivation and how you can support people, and also just yourself as well. So I think there's so many great take homes from that. So Ben, I thought I'd just sort of talk a little bit more about that in particular at the moment with regards to sort of motivation. And, service providers, a lot of our listeners are working a lot with people to try to support them to maybe stick to some programs that might be developed for them. So what are some of the key principles that we need to know about motivation? Big question.
Yeah, great question. There's people are sometimes surprised to kind of hear that there's a science of motivation, right? It can be tricky to put our finger on, but there's a really, really interesting and rich literature around understanding motivation. And when we think about motivation in its simplest form, we often think about how much of it someone has for a given behavior. We think about its quantity, whether somebody is persistent and committed and putting in effort to their rehab program or to their physical activity participation or to their healthy eating regime. And understanding the quantity is one thing, and that's great and it's important. But understanding the quality of someone's motivation is the thing that we focus on most commonly, and trying to understand why people are doing the things that they're doing. And there's a wonderful theory that unpacks that and is really well established and researched and well supported, called self-determination theory, that talks about a continuum of motivational types or motivational qualities. And at the far end, I suppose at the less adaptive end is those instances where people are doing things because they've been told to, because they feel guilty if they don't do it, because they're doing it simply to try and get some external reward. Picture the person who works hard purely for the pay rise rather than because they enjoy their work. And if you move along that continuum towards the more positive or adaptive end, and it's these things that help us stick to behavioral programs and services and adhere to these things. The sorts of motivations that we try to encourage in people are when they're doing something purely for the love of it, for the enjoyment, for the interest, for the inherent satisfaction that they get out of the thing that they're trying to do. Or in cases where that's just not achievable, I understand that, for instance, a rehab program for a family where there's a young kid with difficulty can be really difficult, and they're not going to do that often because they love the program, purely because of the fun that it brings, right? They're going to try and find other reasons, but we'll try to promote what we call self-determined or autonomous reasons for that behavior. And those are things like seeing the value in the behavior, starting to integrate what it is that you're doing with your sense of self and who you are and and whether it fits with who you think you are. So the way that we try to encourage those sorts of motivation are with what we refer to as need supportive behaviors. The guys who put together self-determination theory are geniuses and are also really, really in touch and speak about the theory in a really nice, practical way. And they talk about all humans having 3 universal psychological needs that we must satisfy in any conditions that we're in. And those 3 needs are autonomy, competence and relatedness. Autonomy, the sense of volition, feeling in control of what we're doing. Competence, feeling capable in our pursuits. And relatedness, not just feeling connected to others, but feeling meaningfully, closely connected to other people in that situation. And so there's the practical part of the theory, right? There's the thing that we can change. When we develop programs, we can go, okay, literally, the checklist comes out. Are we catering for people's need for autonomy? Are we giving them choice in how we're doing things? Are we explaining and providing good rationale for why we're developing the programs that we're developing, pitching things the way that we're pitching to them? Are we trying to build their competence? Are we keeping an eye on them to make sure that we're not pushing them too far, or that we're not pushing them at all? Are we finding that nice balance where they're developing a sense of capability? And then are we fitting that relatedness piece together? Are people feeling closely connected to us and to other people in the programs? And if we can do those things, we get those more positive forms of motivation out, and that's where people start to really thrive.
Well, I think there's so much you can even just take from that as I'm just digesting it. The thing that comes to my mind right now is you kind of think of a skilled clinician. I know it's been a question before to some of our podcast from some of our podcast listeners is like, how do we know who's a skilled clinician? And I feel like what you've just described there are some of the things that make you a good skilled clinician. It's the ability to look at all three of those factors and understand how you can support a person through their program. But then, Ash, do you reckon it's like F words?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They tie in so closely together, things like family, friends, fun, future. All those things I think tie in really nicely to that.
Yeah,
framework.
I'm familiar with the ICF, the F words.
Yes.
We I promise, independently came up with our own sort of literal F words. And those are fun, friends, and finding out, friends and family, and finding out, what you like, finding out who you are, finding out how far you can go, those sorts of things that seem to push people along. And you make a great point, Dana, about these behaviors being elements of a skilled clinician. I completely agree with you. When we think about skill in those sorts of settings, we often think of the technical stuff. Do you know, do you know the rules and the prescriptions and all those sorts of things? But actually the softer skills, those psychological skills are just as, I would say, even more important in terms of getting people to enjoy and engage with the programs that we provide. And it doesn't just those things don't just make you a skilled clinician. They make you they make good teachers. They make good parents as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that comes to mind and came into my mind when you were talking through and giving an overview of the theory, Ben, is how we perhaps use some of these principles without kind of knowing the science behind them to help us with goal setting. So, for programs, we know that, when goals are meaningful to children and their families, that's a really kind of key point to making sure that a program is enjoyable and that it's something that they're likely to adhere to, as you said. So I feel like, how maybe you could give us a bit more of an explicit explanation as to how people might be able to use the theory to set goals with families.
Yeah, thanks, Ash. Yeah, it's an inherent part of that theory and of the work that we do that's bounded by that theory. Goal setting itself is probably most closely considered an element of competence support. That, if we set goals and work towards them, then we've got objective information about our capability, right? And it inevitably, if we set good goals, does help us to develop those perceptions of competence. But goal setting also can be imbued with principles of those other needs, right? You should be setting goals with somebody who you feel related to, who you feel closely connected to, because they're going to matter more. You should be given choice about the goals that you set. And it sounds like a really obvious recommendation, but sometimes that doesn't happen, right? And sometimes, to being realistic, there are times when we maybe can't give complete choice over the goals that we encourage people to set for a therapy program or for a behavioral activation or service or activity of any kind. We'll then provide rationale about why we're setting the goals in the way that we are, if we can't provide complete choice over things. So those elements are really useful, I think.
Yeah, and choice within the limitations of, if it's a program where you're focusing, say it's an upper limb intervention that you're doing and, explaining to the family that that's the focus of the program.
Yep.
So, but there's choice within that still. So they still feel that element of autonomy, but it's within the parameters of your program.
Yeah, we often talk about it as bounded choice. That you, to an extent, look for the opportunities to provide opportunity and options.
Yeah. I think that closely relates to we've spoken about the clinical guidelines, which is something that's so exciting for us as clinicians, is to have a set of guidelines that's based on research principles and good practice principles, which have all of these elements that you're talking about, Ben, and how we now sort of communicate these messages to families to help to support all those choice-making skills, and how clinicians can also use that information to support people in making those decisions as well. So I thought we could talk a little bit about that in terms of how can we message these principles across, because they sometimes are, like you said before, it can get caught in this academia land where it's really important to understand that, and that's still very, very important. But the next step is, how do we communicate this to people, the consumers, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dana. Thank you. I suppose trying to tie together, the way that we introduce things with what we just talked about in terms of motivation. Although self-determination theory is a theory of motivation, in practice, the way that we practically apply it, it's a theory of communication largely. Interpersonal, often in person, one-to-one communication strategies that can develop those psych needs, but there's a whole communication piece that is missing in that sense, in the kind of the mass communication, the impersonal messaging that's associated with associated with trying to promote the right sorts of behaviors and engagement in rehabilitation or health promoting behaviors. And we've done a fair bit of work on those sorts of less personal messaging and communication strategies. One of the things that I keep in mind, and that is very relevant in today's world, is the importance of balance in those messages. Now, we would, I hesitate to go here with the way the world is at the moment, but let's pluck vaccinations off the hot topic tree. You might take a position that we really, really, really want everybody to get vaccinated. And we might think that the best way to promote people to do that is to just slam the message in their face that, hey, you've got to get out and get vaccinated for all these reasons.
Yep.
That will work with many, but clearly doesn't with everyone.
Yeah.
And there's benefit in these situations to being more balanced with our messaging. There's 40 or 50 or 60 years worth of research that shows that what we call two-sided messages can be really powerful in trying to persuade people to take a certain action or to ignore certain other recommendations or strategies. So we often use those sorts of approaches. We don't, again, back to the example, if we're trying to encourage people to go get vaccinated, we don't ignore the anti-vax messages, but we would raise some of those anti-vax messages and acknowledge them, understand that they're out there, but then refute them. At the same time. And that's what the two-sided message is doing. So people come away from seeing the paragraph or the page or the flyer that they've read about the issue or a service. And they think, okay, well, for a start, these guys who just spoke to me were honest. They recognized both sides of an argument, but they gave me good information as to why I should take that side of the argument. And those sorts of messages can be really powerful. And I think, that there's definitely something to kind of learn in terms of how well to craft a message from that. Sometimes we think it's best to avoid that other path that we don't want people to take, but actually the research shows that it might be worth including but refuting those approaches.
Okay. Does that, I suppose, as the messenger, and I say that, in inverted commas, does that give a bit more credibility to what you're saying, if you are acknowledging kind of what's under the rug, so to speak, but also then providing the rationale for why your, I suppose, argument is the better one, or the one that
Yeah. I mean, I'm not aware of whether I'm sure that has been shown, Ash, and I wish I had a better knowledge of the literature. What we have seen and shown is that people tend to what we call elaborate on those messages, as in think about them.
Right. Sure.
So if you craft messages like that, you seem to be able to get people to engage with the content in the message, and then it comes down to whether you've written the right message as to whether it has the right effect or not.
Yeah.
This probably ties in with what we were just talking about, but I know there is another theory that around messaging, and again, going down the vaccine train, inoculation theory. Could you talk to us a little bit about what inoculation theory is and how we can use that to craft our messages?
It was developed in the 60s on the back of the analogy to medical vaccination, this idea that I'm way beyond my comfort zone talking about anything medical, but the idea that, when we're vaccinated in a medical sense, we get injected with some typically, weakened or inert strain of a virus that then adapts in the body through cell adaptation, and we end up with immunity to stronger attacks from that virus in the future.
Yes.
Psychologically, William Maguire said, we can do exactly the same thing with the principle of two-sided messages. So if we take somebody who has a position that they are against drug taking, or they are against binge drinking, or they are, these positions, these in inverted commas, healthy positions that we would want people to have, or that they're against experimentation with drugs, for instance. We would craft a message that kind of is built on those two-sided arguments that says, hey, first part of the message, hey, we know that you've got this really, again, dumbing it down, but we know you've got this really good stance on this issue right now, but just be warned, there'll be things that might challenge that. And so we're trying to raise a threat level, effectively, trying to get people to pay attention. Yeah. And then you hit the literature to try and understand what are the 2 or 3 or 4 key things that might challenge someone's position on that issue. Right. So, I might be trying to promote a certain kind of therapy, or I might be trying to promote engagement in physical activity. And I look at, okay, well, what are the arguments against that kind of therapy? Or what are the arguments against, or what are the challenges against being regularly physically active? Yeah. Show people those, talk about what they are, but then provide good material that helps people get around those, either attitudinally or behaviorally when those things come up. Yeah. And that's the principle behind inoculation theory. We've used it. It's typically been used for attitudes towards things like binge drinking and safe sex practices. Sure. We've used it to try and protect against things like anxiety. Yeah. Hey, you're about to give a public speech. Here are the things that typically stress people out about that, but here's why they don't need to, or here's why you might reframe them and think about them differently. Sure. We've also tried to use it to protect against motivation. So we've said, hey, it's great when people experience these positive forms of motivation, but actually things happen that will try and take you away from that position. So here's how you might get back there. Right. And so it's about setting people up. It's kind of an if-then plan in a way. If these things happen, they might take you away from the position or the behavior that you're trying to work on or stick to, but they don't need to. You can get back to that right. Ideal state, hopefully. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
And I think, so from that sort of example, I'm just thinking of, often when clinicians are on the road and they're having conversations with families and they're happening sort of in real time, and a family might ask a question about an intervention that might not have any evidence to support it, or an intervention that does have evidence to support it. And they might be erring on the side of maybe potentially going down a path where there's just not enough research to support that particular factor. So the clinician's sort of there real time kind of trying to give the information to the families. So what will your advice be for people who are, trying to communicate with people who are asking them these questions? Well, relatively big questions really of people making decisions about what they want to do.
That's a tough one. And I suppose, the skill in doing that well relies first on the kind of the expert in the conversation being an expert, really knowing the literature and the evidence for or against, or that doesn't exist in relation to different therapies or different approaches, for instance. So let's assume that piece of the puzzle is there. Yeah. Well, at that point, I would try to click back into those things that we've previously talked about. I would try to go, okay, I know where I want this person to end up, but I don't necessarily need them to get there with a 30-second conversation.
That's right.
Let's unpack. I get that phrase. Let's unpack this. Yeah. Let's understand in a bit more detail the pros and the cons.
Yeah.
Let's try and build a bit of needs support, a bit of a choice and rationale and understanding and connection into the conversation that we have, and understand their position as best you can. And from that foundation, I guess, is probably the greatest likelihood of getting where you want to get to.
Sure. Yeah.
I feel like I can speak to this topic because it's something that happens to me quite regularly, but often when people try to give me advice or I have this quite strong reactance to that, and I'm just wondering how we can try and avoid that with the families or people that we might be speaking to who we might be trying to provide really positive messaging to try and avoid that reactance effect.
Yeah, it's a good point, Ash, and I'm smiling because there's a trait that reflects our level of trait reactance, just our proneness or our tendency to take against what we're told, and we can't.
Also, I can't do anything about it. That's good.
And mine is also high, which is probably why I'm interested in this stuff. But we've done a bit of work on deliberately trying to pull out those reactions from people to see what sorts of things might push people's buttons, so to speak. And there's a few things. Making people angry is one of the, making people angry with our messaging, in person or in print, is one of those things that is bound to activate that, and to push people in completely the opposite direction to where we're trying to get them. This idea as well of what we call freedom threat. People reading a message and inferring, rightly or wrongly, that you're telling them what to do and taking away their liberty and their freedom and their autonomy, over the decision that they're able to make. So, we've crafted in the past to play around with this. We've crafted exercise promotion messages that either tell people that, hey, this amazing program is coming to Perth. You'll have no choice but to sign up for this thing. Everybody tells us it's the greatest thing they've done, and we've kind of been really emphatic and to an extent a bit, overly promotional about the way that we've pitched things, versus a much more sensitive. We recognize everybody's different, and we would love for you to give this a try and see how you go. That sort of message. Yeah. And surprise, in both situations, if you imbue those messages with lots of stats about how well people find how good people's experiences are in the program and how well people find them, you're able to have people expect that the programs will be enjoyable or interesting, but the emotional reactions around those expectations are the really important parts. And through those sorts of different approaches, you can see one group of people getting angry and feeling that their freedoms are threatened. Yeah. And as a result, probably if they ever did that exercise program, trying to disconfirm their expectations around enjoyment and so on, looking for a way to prove me wrong, versus those people who've had a sensitive, autonomy supportive message who feel like, oh, you know what? Yeah, this thing sounds good, and I'm going to try and find ways to support that expectation. So it's a really key element of intelligent and careful messaging, I think. Yeah.
And then kind of related to that, I think sometimes with messaging, we can fall into the trap of trying to scare people into taking an action or trying to do what we want them to do. And the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about that is like cigarette packaging. So, here's all the dangers of smoking cigarettes, but people do it anyway. So does that kind of messaging work, that kind of fear-mongering?
Yes, it can. That's why it's done. Yeah, but you're right. It's far from as simple as let's just freak people out, and that will stop people doing all these things that we don't want them to do. It's built on the premise that these fear-based or threat appeals are built on the premise that this idea of scaring people into action kind of activates them. See the smoker who sees the image on the cigarette packet that is designed to activate and to try and get an emotional response out. it almost always works in that sense, because those things are shocking, right?
Yeah.
So they do have that emotional response, but what happens as a result of that, it can be very different. So what we can do, if we see those sorts of messages, those fear appeals, those threats, we can stick our head in the sand. If we feel like, if I'm a smoker who's smoked for 20 years, 20 a day, and has very little confidence that I could do anything to change that, when I see that message, I still see the image, but I then bury my head in the sand, and I try and control the fear rather than controlling anything about the behavioral response. Yeah. So I say, oh well, nothing's happened to me yet. I'm fine. So I make up those sorts of justifications. Whereas if I see those sorts of messages accompanied with information or resources that provide me with a bit of confidence that I can do something about it. Yeah. And this idea of what we call response efficacy, that if I take an action, if I make a response in relation to that response will have some beneficial effect for me. Then it's that kind of, it's the confidence building stuff and the resources around those scary messages. Yeah. That's when the situation can work. The literature shows.
Yeah.
I find that really interesting because I just recently, as most clinicians, who are registered with APRA, we have our APRA registrations, and I was going through mine, but it does go through there in terms of, our advertising standards and avoiding testimonials and just having some standards around that, because you can see how this sort of messaging, you can, without realizing, be quite manipulating in terms of, the response that you might get from people who are looking for a service. Yeah. And potentially looking at a group of people who might be quite vulnerable, early diagnosis, looking for some services, and the messaging that might be put around that, which might be promotional of a service, but it could also go down that path, couldn't it? You could say there's limited spots available. You must sign up now, and you kind of like, oh, I'll sign up then, and because you want to get those sort of spots. I'm sort of thinking about those sort of impacts. We've got to be so careful, don't we?
Yeah, you've raised a really cool point, Dana. There's a fantastic program of work that was developed and run primarily by Robert Cialdini in the US, who talks about the weapons of influence, the weapons, the weapons of social influence. And one of those weapons of social influence are basically, what tips and tricks and tactics can we use to try and get people to do what we want, right? Yeah. Is scarcity. That idea of, hey, there's only 3 cars left. We've sold 6,000. There's only 3 cars left. Oh, this sale's only going to be on Black Friday, and then it's over. Those things. And even though I know the science behind it, they still have that same effect.
Still running to the shop.
That's right.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and then as soon as we know about that, but as soon as you transfer it into a setting where you're trying to provide a service and you're trying to support people making those decisions, it just shows that you've got to be so careful about that. And when we're talking about, supporting evidence-based practice and getting that messaging out, it's just so layered, isn't it? But there's more to think about there, I think, is what that says to me.
Yeah. Sure. And when I look at those, just briefly back to those weapons of influence, I guess, when I look at those, I think that there are some of them that are a little bit more Machiavellian and kind of dark side, like the scarcity stuff. There are some that seem to work just as well, that are much, much more positive and that we should try and hook to. And those are things like liking. People are more likely to do what we want if they like us as well. And so being a nice person has its benefits too, right? So keep it, and you can't, one of the things I think about messaging and communication a lot, and certainly doesn't make me good at it, but I think about it an awful lot and I overthink about it. One of the things that I have to remind myself is you can't control other people's messaging. Yeah. And so all you can do is look after your own and try and make sure that your own is sensitive and well informed and research backed.
Yeah, no, that's really great advice. So we sort of touched on it now, I guess. We're sort of going to that area about social support, and on your website for PAHL, it does talk about, harnessing the power of people and the programs that you and your team have developed. So how do you do that?
Yeah, we try. I guess a bit of backstory. Our background with the group is primarily a bunch of jocks. We were all sports scientists who then specialized in psychology. And so a lot of what we started out doing was physical activity promotion, and we still do an awful lot of that. It's physical activity or sport promotion. the thing that I loved about sport, which I played my whole life growing up, was not necessarily kicking the soccer ball or playing cricket. It was the people that were around me. And it's you know, I don't miss kicking the soccer ball, the act of kicking. I miss the changing room.
Yeah.
And you know, so in looking at what it was in sport and physical activity, when it was working well, what was it that was having the positive effects? It was the people that we so often found ourselves talking about and sharing stories about. So in broadening our work beyond physical activity and sport promotion, we've tried to keep that idea of you know, good groups, good teams, good people, good supporters and therapists and teachers and instructors, and what it is that makes those people, you know, able to support as well. The impetus for it is that we so often, and you know, we're absolutely not trying to say that this is in any way groundbreaking. We so often see messages about trying to get the right kinds of support and trying to find social support. But what I think is sometimes missed in that message is that not all forms of social support are good. You know, we could all think of toxic social support, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The one of the things that we often find ourselves talking about in this sort of situation is this idea of, you know, today's social media paradox. We now are better connected all the time to everyone than we've ever been before. So in a way, if you think about it, kind of in a rational sense, well, we're more connected. We should feel more support than ever. But social media makes most people feel pretty crap often. And so, you know, there's that paradox there. It's not necessarily the right sorts of support. And I know, you know, we've got a couple of young kids, and so I've seen and spoken to lots of parents of young kids, and mothers groups is another example of this sort of thing, where mothers groups can be wonderful and can be, you know, a life-changing support for some new mums, but they can also be fairly ostracizing at times. If the conversation in those mothers groups is about who's got the most expensive pram, or how wonderful someone's child is and how well they're sleeping, then other mums, you know, feel awful as a result of that. And so, you know, and in our world, promoting people to be more physically active, well, if you take somebody who's been on the couch for 10 years and feels a bit out of shape and doesn't feel great about their body, and you send them to a gym where there's a bunch of people pounding the treadmill who look like gods and goddesses. I mean, there's people around them, but they're the wrong sorts of people. So we really try and focus on making sure that we get the right sort of social support around people. How do we do that? Well, partly it's back to, you know, sensitive communication and providing, you know, wherever we can from instructors or teachers or from peers in the sessions and the services that we're running, need support. Making sure that people care, you know, and understanding some really simple stuff. We talk an awful lot in our programs about not giving unsolicited advice. You know, so often we want to jump in and provide help, when actually just listening is something that's really, really valuable, and genuinely listening to what the person is saying is really powerful. Not just waiting for your next turn to talk. We've done some work on humor and how well that can be used to kind of bind people to each other and to programs and services that we run, and how it can go wrong as well. So those sorts of things, I think, are what we consider when we're trying to put those ingredients into action.
And I think one of the things that has probably come across earlier in some of our discussion around messaging and communication, but I think probably also ties into this idea of good social support, is being able to take perspective and take on the other person's perspective and what the other person might be thinking or feeling, and really kind of trying to understand their position on things and using that to create those positive connections. Do you think that's an important part of it as well?
I do, yeah. It's an essential part of it. And, you know, we're not all naturally born to be great perspective takers. You know, it's not necessarily something that we're all, you know, equipped with, but I would encourage people, if they're not sure whether they're doing that well or not, just ask more questions. Really, really try to listen. And, you know, that sounds like such simple advice, but I find myself so often in conversation doing this sort of surface level part of the conversation, fine. But if you ask me half an hour later, that meeting that you had at work, what was going on? How did that other person feel? I'd be like, oh yeah, I don't know if I stopped to think through that.
Sure.
So that sort of stuff is really key. And, a simple trick or tip in that sense is paraphrasing. Hey, Ash, what I think I'm hearing is this. Am I right? You explained that and I heard it this way. Those sorts of things can really make people feel heard and can be really useful.
Yeah.
Gosh, there's so many things to take away from that as well. And as you're describing that in terms of mothers groups, I often hear from families when they've got children with disability, they might be part of groups and might be quite well supported. But as we know, so many children are so different and they have different experiences, and they look on social media, they see some kids just, achieving all their goals, doing really well, and their child might be having, this, medically might not be doing so good, but they're so different to other people. So finding that relatedness and finding people with similar stories can be really tricky. And I think as therapists, we have the power of knowing quite a lot of stories. We know a lot of people and where they're at, and there is actually a lot of strength there, I think, in just listening and potentially helping people to make those connections if you do hear similar stories, doing it with privacy, of course, and understanding how to do that. But there's so much power in that, really, isn't there?
I agree, Dana. And when I think about the social media stuff, this certainly isn't my phrase, but I've heard it and really like it.
Yeah.
The things that we see there, we inherently, we can't help but compare ourselves to what we see. This snapshot of perfect life that we see on Instagram or Facebook or whatever it might be. We always encourage people, don't compare your insides to other people's outsides, because you don't know what's going on in those situations. Right. You just captured a moment of utopia and showed the world, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Ben. I feel like throughout that whole chat, we've come away with some real key take-home messages for therapists and clinicians, people listening today, that they can actually, implement into their everyday conversations with families, with each other, things that they can do to kind of promote motivation and, that idea of social support. And I feel like that was a really valuable chat. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you. It was lots of fun.
Well, we're not over just yet, because as you know, we're about to head into our supposedly most popular segment. Now we're going to head into the next segment, which is called Tell It to Ed. And as you know, Ed is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health or any of these areas that we talk about, but he has been listening, and lately I've been seeing his laptop out. He's taking notes, ready for some very intelligent questions, I suppose. So Ben, no pressure or anything, but here we go for the most popular segment. In about 60 seconds or so, can you summarize some of the key take-home messages of what we spoke about today? And in turn, Ed will ask a question.
This is the one bit that I'm nervous about.
Everyone says that.
I've listened to the podcast.
Right.
Well, where did we go? Yeah, what an amount to cover in 60 seconds. What I think is probably most important to help summarize is that most of the folks who are listening to the podcast, and certainly those of us who are here recording, are people who try and help others with some goal, that they have in mind. And if we don't use all that we know about motivation and communication and messaging and sensitivity and listening, then we're setting, I think, those people up to fail. It's really, really hard to do anything on our own without the right support of others. And so everything that we've talked about today, I think, and I hope, is about how to try to put in place the right sorts of support around people that can help them achieve whatever that goal might be.
I love that. That was a brilliant summary, and I feel very inspired. That was pretty good.
But now is the high pressure situation, because Ed has a great track record of asking very insightful questions, Ben. So
I'm excited
for our most popular segment.
I'm afraid that the streak is going to come to an end today. It's really insightful to hear about somebody talk about the psychology and the communication aspects of all the things that we've been listening to for the last 36 episodes. So prior to doing some stuff that I'm dabbling in IT now, I've been in marketing for a really long time. So worked for a big corporation who specialised in getting a message out about marketing. And so some of the things that you spoke about, we were just drilled that information into in terms of how to manipulate that. So I'm really intrigued in, obviously there's good science and there's bad science, and we've heard about some of the discussions over evidence-based practice. How worried are you about these types of skills being used for more nefarious purposes where someone like myself in a previous life spent a lot of time in terms of how to market and communicate a message that was very manipulated for me to get my result. And yet you spoke about some great things that when people have altruistic motivations kind of can use that to get across a really great message. How worried are you about that being used for something not so great?
Ooh.
Very.
That was a long question, but sorry.
No, it's a wonderful question. And I mentioned earlier, thanks, that's such a cool question. I mentioned earlier that I spend a lot of time, I overthink messaging and communicate. And that's one of the things that I overthink is, you start to think, a bit about this. You could use it for good, or you could use it for the alternative. And for every piece of these days, for every piece of information there's 15 pieces of misinformation as well, right? So, the answer is probably not a sexy one, but it's, education, it helps. The more you know about this stuff, the more you see it. It doesn't necessarily remove the possibility of those things happening, but it definitely helps. So anything like this can be useful. And I suppose in practice, I often come back to that idea of inoculation and trying to let people know that, there will be, no matter how much we try to protect you from them, there will be these sources of influence that we're better off avoiding. Don't bury people's heads in the sand about them. Give people credit and let them know that they're out there and that they're coming. And actually, inoculation is a nice example of that, because it's being used by researchers to try and protect people against fake news and misinformation. So we use it in a health setting, but others are using it in that sort of message processing way. So that's about the best way that we try and deal with it, I think. But it's such a thorny issue.
Nice. Oh, I think I'm being afforded my second question without begging for it.
I'm trying to be respectful, looking over.
Okay, so my second question then is not being a part of healthcare or research or any of that sort of stuff. I'm well aware of the fact that it's not particularly easy for families, clinicians and people to get access to research materials because it tends to get hidden away in pay for journals. So the ability to get access to that information and then your ability to then translate that in some communicative form, what impact does that have in terms of trying to get across a cohesive argument or like a communication of something very important when some of that original source material is kind of hidden away?
Yeah, and I would strongly agree with you and say that it's not even some, it's lots of that, that good information that's being generated is hidden behind a paywall, and the people who need to get it are the people who are least likely to be able to get it. And so, in the past, I think researchers, and I am one, so I consider myself part of this, have probably paid lip service to that. We need to do much more. We need to do an awful lot more as a field to not just talk about translation and the importance of it, but to do it and to get out and make sure that we're directly reaching those people. And if I could very briefly just plug how exceptionally Telethon Kids Institute does that. It's wonderful. And there are people at UWA doing great work in that space too. But Telethon Kids is built on that premise, on making sure that the families and the kids who need to know these things know them. So I think I hope that's the way that lots of places will go forward in the future.
I love that. That was actually quite a good second question.
Yeah,
So
we'll allow it.
Yeah, he's not bad. He's not bad. The track
Will I
record
get a third at
continues.
some point?
No.
Okay.
He's plotting to take over
He is. Pretty
the.
much is what's happening here. Well, thank you so very, very much, Ben, for being on the show today. I learned so much from that. I know all of our listeners are just going to enjoy that. I'm going to listen to that quite a few times because I think there's so many pearls of wisdom there. So thank you so much for your time and sharing your wisdom and knowledge.
It's been a pleasure. My students at UWA tell me that my voice is good because it puts them to sleep. So if I'm useful for that, then I'll be delighted.
Yep. And we all look forward to visiting Uncle Benny's Sandwich Shack.
We do indeed. We do indeed. So remember, if you want any links to any of some of the information we've spoken about as well, and some access to who Ben is and what he does as well, you'll find that on our website, researchworks.net. And remember, there's a CPD form on our website as well if you want to keep this as part of a record for your PD. But for now, we say goodbye and we'll talk to you all again next time. Bye.